is a human. Hmm. Says we're not streaming to YouTube yet. I guess we could wait a minute or two or some. Alright, now it's working. Not that I expect a large viewership. Welcome to the 110th episode of the Henry George Daily Devotional, where I read from Henry George's book, Progress and Poverty, an inquiry into the cause of industrial depressions and the increase of want. And increase of want with increase of wealth. The Remedy, published in 1879. His ideas caused a movement. One of his adherents, Lizzie McGee, created the board game Monopoly, originally named Landlord's Game, starting in a couple 30th, 31st, 1st, 2nd, and 4 days. I will be organizing the Henry George Game Jam, the George Jam, sort of inspired by George and Lizzie McGee's game, Landlord's Game. Maybe on the Henry George Daily Devotional, I will go through everyone's games at the end of the jam. Who knows? For now, we read, and this is where we left off, Book 10, The Law of Human Progress, Chapter 3, The Law of Human Progress. George writes, I am merely attempting to set forth the general fact that as a social development goes on, inequality tends to establish itself, and not to point out the particular sequence, which must necessarily vary with different conditions. But this main fact makes intelligible all the phenomena of petrifaction and retrogression. The unequal distribution of the power and wealth gained by the integration of men in society tends to check and finally to counterbalance the force by which improvements are made and society advances. On the one side, the masses of the community are compelled to extend their mental powers in merely maintaining existence. On the other side, mental power is expended in keeping up and intensifying the system of inequality, in ostentation, luxury, and warfare. A community divided into a class that rules and a class that is ruled, into the very rich and the very poor, may build like giants and finish like jewelers, but it will be mountains of ruthless pride and barren vanity, or of a religion turned from its office of elevating man into an instrument for keeping him down. Invention may for a while, to some degree, go on, but it will be the invention in refinements in luxury, not the inventions that relieve toil and increase power. In the arcana of temples or in the chambers of court physicians, knowledge may still be sought, but it will be hidden as a secret thing, or if it dares come out to elevate common thought or brighten common life, it will be trodden down as a dangerous innovator. For as it tends to lessen the mental power devoted to improvement, so does inequality tend to render men adverse to improvement. How strong is the disposition to adhere to old methods among the classes who are kept in ignorance by being compelled to toil for a mere existence? It is too well known to require illustration. Yes, this is almost always the case with low-wage workers when there's an invention that's going to take away their jobs and they hate it, and they're right to hate it because it's only going to enrich the owners, the land owners. Too often we think of these owners as being the capital owners. They are the land owners. And on the other hand, the conservatism of the classes to whom the existing social adjustments give special advantages is equally apparent. This tendency to resist innovation, even though it be improvement, is observable in every special organization, in religion, in law, in medicine, in science, in trade guilds. And it becomes intense just as the organization is close. A close corporation has always an instinctive dislike of innovation and innovators, which is but the expression of an instinctive fear that change may tend to throw down the barriers which hedge it in from the common herd, and so rob it of importance and power. And it is always disposed to guard carefully its special knowledge or skill. It is in this way that petrifaction succeeds progress. The advance of inequality necessarily brings improvement to a halt, and as it still persists or provokes unavailing reactions, draws even upon the mental power necessary for maintenance, and retrogression begins. These principles make intelligible the history of civilization. In the localities where climate, soil, and physical conformation, yeah, quick pause. I've been struggling a lot with this idea, you know, if George was right in his time and we never really got the land value tax, shouldn't everything have gotten horribler, and more horribler, shittier and shittier? Um, but what George is saying is, some progress, some development, some advances may still go on in some places. The momentum and the of the original equality and association that allowed a society, civilization, to gain the level of progress that it did gain can carry with it a lot of momentum. I think this is true in the USA. And then I think that actually George and his followers actually had a fair amount of actual influence in bringing bits and pieces of equality back to society. I think, women voting, uh, the civil rights movement. Uh, I even saw, it's this horrible trade-off that was made in the New Deal and after some of the world wars of, yes, it was sort of good to not allow the big landlords to keep grabbing up more land, and we gave it to a lot of veterans, and we encouraged a lot of, suburban homesteading, quote unquote. But it was really, it's a terrible appeasement that we did, um, by enabling a whole class of peasant proprietors who aren't even, as Land and, I just finished reading Land and Liberty. Oh man, there's a lot to talk about there, but the idea of suburban homeowners being something like a homesteader, even though I don't like homesteading quite ideally either through George's view, it's even worse with suburban owners, uh, because they are only slightly able to. They become a class that supports landlordism. They don't really benefit that much from being a landlord because a lot of the rents are still being sucked up by the banks. Even if they were, I mean, who would it's kind of a dumb question about what individual would I rather benefit from rent seeking? Would I rather there be a landlord who had a house and owned it outright and took all those rents, or would I rather some bank own all of the houses and get all the rents? I guess I'd rather an individual landlord own it because they're living in that, they're in that community and they might treat people fairly. The problem, though, is that empowers a landlord. I mean, both situations are just empowering landlords and making the actual bringing of justice harder and harder. And so Yeah, it's kind of like I don't. How exactly does the year of Jubilee work? Um, every 50 years, uh, indentured servants will be released, some debts forgiven. You return their. Everyone's supposed to return to their own property. I don't know. I mean, but at least it was cyclical. Like if we simply split up the United States into like, 330 million parcels and randomly handed those out or whatever every 50 years, okay. But we sort of did that once and or like maybe twice. Once when like the westward expansion was happening, and then again kind of during the suburban expansion and the after the car was sort of a thing. And now those landlord possessions have ripened. I don't know how to say it. So I think that this description very much fits uh, the pattern, or USA very much fits this pattern described. Um, I think what this doesn't quite focus on very much is the power of artificially granted monopoly in the form of IP, which has, that I think is nearly completely explains the dominance of a small number of men owning all of the tech industry. But all right, let's get back to George. Um, in the localities where climate, soil, and physical conformation tended least to separate men as they increased, and where accordingly the first civilizations grew up, the internal resistances to progress would naturally develop in a more regular and thorough manner than where smaller communities, which in their separation had developed diversities, were afterward brought together into a closer association. It is this, it seems to me, which accounts for the general um, characteristics of the earlier civilizations as compared with the later civilizations of Europe. Such homogeneous communities developing from the first, without the jar of conflict between different customs, laws, religions, etc., would show a much greater uniformity. Such homogeneous communities developing from the first without the jar of conflict between different customs would show a much greater uniformity. The concentrating and conservative forces would all, so to speak, pull together. Rival chieftains would not counterbalance each other, nor diversities of belief hold the growth of priestly influence in check. Political and religious power, wealth, and knowledge would thus tend to concentrate in the same centers. The same causes which tended to produce the hereditary king and hereditary priest would tend to produce the hereditary artisan and laborer, and to separate society into castes. The power which association sets free for progress would thus be wasted, and barriers to further progress would be gradually raised. The surplus energies of the masses would be devoted to the construction of temples, palaces, and pyramids, to ministering to the pride and pampering the luxury of their rulers, and should any disposition to improvement arise among the classes of leisure, it would at once be checked by the dread of innovation. Society developing in this way must at length stop in a conservatism which permits no further progress. I mean, the funny thing is, with this description, it almost seems inevitable that the human species would develop into this tyrannical society where the people who claimed a bunch of land first became the lords. And like that might be the case, but it seems unsatisfying to me, I guess, that it is sort of inevitable that a society gets it wrong, or that humanity, like, it it does seem weird to me from some sort of like super God's eyes perspective that like the human species has managed to create this like forms of tyranny like far, far worse than any other animal species. But maybe that makes sense I mean, it has to at least be partly rooted in the fact of our much greater capabilities. I don't know. I guess you can imagine animals committing gross atrocities against one another and not really caring at all. I don't think I don't think too many packs of wolves or herds of whatever would care at all if they were to get as much food and land or mating rights as possible, and that ended up totally destroying or annihilating other members of their own species. A dog eat dog world out there. I was going to also say, I think one of the other big reasons the U.S. Uh, has still progressed since George's time is the just charitable efforts of much of our society. I don't mean, I mean the welfare state, true, but also like literal charities and the genuine like brotherhood of humans everywhere. And there is this like, as George argues, like the wealthy people do develop these greater um, they have more of an opportunity perhaps to develop their moral sensibilities. Because some of the kindest people I know are definitely are definitely wealthy people who have given up much of their wealth and time and life to help the downtrodden. And yet, as George writes, charity as a substitute for justice, where charity is false, futile, and poisonous when offered as a substitute for justice. That's a tough one. I definitely feel this more about government efforts than about individual charitable efforts. But I also feel like charity does sometimes get in the way of justice and true reform. If you keep handing out a bunch of money, those people won't revolt. Tossing, giving bread to the masses in the Colosseum dupes them. The California State Lottery dupes them into being non-revolutionary. And it's hard for me to advocate for bloody revolution given how comfortable and good my life is. So I can't do it yet. But I think our civilization is on the way down, and it will only get more desperate. I don't think there's much more momentum left in our society. I do think there is some, but the second derivative is definitely negative. All right, 21 minutes. Well, this is fitting. How long such a state of complete petrifaction, when once reached, will continue seems to depend upon external causes. This is sort of where I believe we're at. For the iron bonds of the social environment which grows up repress disintegrating forces as well as improvement. Such a community can be most easily conquered, for the masses of the people are trained to a passive acquiescence in a life of hopeless labor. If the conquerors merely take the place of the ruling class, as the Hyksos did in Egypt and the Tartars in China, everything will go on before. If they ravage and destroy, the glory of palace and temple remains, but in ruins, population becomes sparse and knowledge and art are lost. Of course, we're so far away from the other powers. Although like I feel like I should learn more about Mexican history. I feel like Canada is just kind of following the footsteps of the USA. Um, and I don't understand how Mexico didn't like peak and fall with it, or maybe they did. I feel like my whole life, 37 years, Mexico has been down and stayed down and hasn't changed much. There hasn't been like a new, but maybe they're just what being crushed underfoot by USA somehow. Like we're the mafia cartel or the mafia. The drug cartels are just somehow, and then of course there's all the Mexican immigration to the USA, so they're just our wage slaves, our corporations' wage slaves. I don't know. All right. Well, doom and gloom in the daily devotional. Bye bye.